Hello, and welcome to the very first Stephen Reads Philosophy. We're going to start with Aristotle's Rhetoric, because that's what I'm reading, and we're just going to look at Book 1, Chapter 1. Some quick background information. Rhetoric is when you're speaking to a lot of people. Dialectic is when you're speaking one-on-one. Aristotle says that everyone does this, and because everyone does this, this is a particularly unique and interesting type of art form or science. Here he uses art and science sort of interchangeably because back then everything was considered an art. And so if I say art, what I mean is a science. That's sort of what that last point's going to be. So Aristotle also said that rhetoric and dialectic don't fit under any particular branch of knowledge. They wouldn't fit under humanities, they wouldn't fit under mathematics, they wouldn't fit necessarily under logic itself, although I'm not sure any of those things were invented at the time. Don't quote me. But what he did say is that these things are unique and therefore they are their own sort of science or art. Aristotle also says that all people come by utilizing rhetoric and dialectic either by chance or by habit. So either it is the case that we accidentally practice some good rhetoric or dialectic in the moment, or we do this habitually and regularly as our own sort of practice. Aristotle bashes the ever-living crap out of the past rhetoricians. He says that the writers of old rhetorical manuals were garbage. He says they focused primarily on utilizing things like lies and slander and really attacking people's emotions to get them to feel or think in a certain way. And Aristotle thinks that that is immoral and that those people are bad and should feel bad. He says instead we should be focusing on things like enthymemes, which the old guys never even mentioned at all. For those of you who don't know, an enthymeme is a syllogism, which is a fancy word for an argument, that has two premises and a conclusion where one of those premises is implied. As an example, someone might say, Socrates is immortal because he's a man. Now here we have the premise, Socrates is a man, and we have the conclusion, Socrates is immortal, but we don't have the premise, every man is a mortal. That is an implied premise that makes it an enthymeme. Enthymemes are going to be very important later on, so keep that in mind. Again, an enthymeme is just a statement or argument where one premise and one conclusion are clearly stated, and a second premise is implied but never stated. Aristotle uses a lot of legal examples and sort of building up the reasons why the old rhetoricians were absolute garbage or trash. He says we should think about law. He says in all good law, the lawyer's one job is to present as much accurate, factual information as possible and leave the rest up to the judge. He says that in any good, decent society, the laws do most of the work, so you sprinkle the facts into the pre-existing laws, and you'll pop out a good solution. If you don't automatically pop out the solution to the situation, the judge then steps in to do as little determination as possible in judging what is right or wrong, what did happen or what didn't happen, and then what should the final verdict be. Aristotle also makes important note that the role of judge and lawyer are crucial because jurors are incredibly emotional and that inevitably they will fall victim to their own humanity and judge things based off of their predispositions, biases, prejudices, and emotions. So Aristotle goes on to remind us that the rhetorical writers of the past still suck. They're still garbage, and that's particularly because they teach how to speak outside the matter at hand. In other words, they tell you how to fluff things up to convince people of nonsense. He says, in political rhetoric, this isn't really a big deal because everyone's kind of invested in politics because politics affects them personally. So when you start talking outside the matter at hand, which people know because they are affected by the matter at hand, then they will immediately sniff out the nonsense and say, hey, I'm not going to be convinced by that because I know that you're deviating from the issues and something's fishy with the way you're talking. However, with judicial rhetoric, there's a huge problem, and that is particularly because jurors don't have any intrinsic attachment to a case. So all of the emotional content is given to them by the lawyer or by the litigant, and so the litigant can very easily manipulate a juror who is otherwise not invested because they're sort of giving them the investment with their rhetoric. So what Aristotle wants to do is change rhetoric. Aristotle wants to introduce a new system of rhetoric, particularly a systematic approach to rhetoric. He says that it should rely on proofs or deductive reasoning. He mentions that deductive reasoning should be the core or sort of the heart or soul of rhetoric, and that the strongest type of deductive argument for rhetoric is the enthymeme. So again, the enthymeme is that argument type with the implied premise. And the reason that enthymemes are so important is because it relies on the audience's propensity for truth. So Aristotle starts to introduce this idea that people inherently are drawn towards the truth like a moth towards the light. And so if you can tap into that, if you can tap into your audience's propensity for truth and propensity for righteousness, then you're going to do a much better job at teaching them the truth or guiding them to the truth or convincing them of the truth with your rhetoric. And he says enthymemes do exactly that. So with an enthymeme, you're going to give half of an argument, the other half of the argument is going to be assumed by the knowledge or wisdom of the audience, and then you're going to say, with my premise, with your assumed knowledge, we can now get to the conclusion. So enthymemes heavily rely on commonly held knowledge or commonly held opinions. He says if you can tap into, if you can understand the knowledge or opinion of the people, then you can wield the power of the enthymeme effectively, because you understand what they are able to imply in your enthymeme arguments. And really, if your audience is filling in the blank in your enthymeme arguments, then they're participating in your argument, and they're more likely to be invested and to buy into your argument. And if your argument is aimed at the truth, and because people have a propensity for the truth, they will be doubly convinced of what you're saying. This is what makes the enthymeme so powerful. He then goes on to say that if an honest man loses in a rhetorical battle, or a dialectic battle, it's absolutely their fault. And that is because people have this inclination towards truth and goodness. So if an honest and good person loses an argument, it is entirely a failing of that person's rhetorical skill, and absolutely not the fault of the truth or the righteousness itself, because those things are always inherently superior to lies and what is wrong and bad. So sort of the last thing Aristotle does in this chapter is give you 4 main values of rhetoric. He says that 1, rhetoric is particularly powerful when it's aimed at the truth. And if you know anything about Aristotle, he was all about virtue. So this was a really cool thing for him, that the power of speech was actually founded in aiming at the truth. So no longer do we have this idea of the silver-tongued serpent who's trying to convince you with rhetoric, but rather we have these truth holders who are now going to be empowered by this skill of rhetoric to spread the truth, and they'll be even more powerful by the fact that they have the truth, which people inherently latch onto. Number 2, he says that people, even honest people, don't always have an easy time convincing people or spreading their truth. So rhetoric will help them do that. And 3rd, he says rhetoric will allow you to know your enemy or really understand opposing arguments. He says it's incredibly important to understand your opposition and even be able to argue for the opposing side. Finally, Aristotle tries to brain shame us. He says that you would be ashamed if you were a weak, scrawny man and you couldn't protect your house from a big, burly guy who wanted to come and steal your stuff and take your wife and kids. So you should equally be ashamed if you have a weak and scrawny mind that can't defend itself against lies and slander and bad arguments. So you need to understand rhetoric so that you can be a beacon of truth for yourself, for your family, for your loved ones, and for the people of the world. In the second to last paragraph, Aristotle sort of rips apart sophists. Aristotle then goes on to remind us that rhetoric is not the art of persuasion, as many people might think it is today. Rhetoric instead is the art of recognizing the means of persuasion. What he means by that is rhetoric is really the ability in any circumstance to see the different possible ways that you could persuade an audience, hopefully of the truth or whatever idea you're trying to convince them of. He also mentions that dialectic is the art of recognizing the truth or true deductions. Really what he's implying here is that when you're speaking one-on-one, your only goal should be trying to find the truth. It shouldn't be trying to convince someone. It should be a back and forth solely concerned with what is the case and what is the truth. He then calls sophistry essentially the art of deception, saying anyone who is called a sophist is really just being called a good liar. And when people are called orators or dialecticians, what's really being said about them is that they are skilled deducers, or that they are skilled in the art of purporting the truth in persuasive ways. Alright, here is a summary of Book 1, Chapter 1 of Aristotle's Rhetoric. Rhetoric and dialectics are for everyone because we all do them naturally anyways. The rhetorical teachers of yesteryear were garbage, and Aristotle was here to change all that and put us on the path to truth and righteousness and virtue. Enthymemes are the heart and soul of rhetorical deductive reasoning because they rely on your ability to argue, the audience's propensity for truth, and also the audience's prior knowledge, which gives a two-part relationship between speaker and audience that works incredibly well for persuasion. It's also very important that Aristotle lets you know that righteousness is inherently stronger than wrongciousness or evil, and that you can use that to your advantage in good rhetoric. Finally, rhetoric is not the art of persuasion, it is all about recognition. So again, rhetoric is the ability to recognize what kind of methods you can use in persuading people, and dialectic is the ability to recognize truth and true deductions. Aristotle finishes by saying, now that I've told you why what everyone else has done is garbage, we're going to start rhetoric from scratch in Chapter 2. And that's all for Book 1, Chapter 1. If you think that anything I said was an inaccurate portrayal of Aristotle's Rhetoric in Book 1, Chapter 1, please let me know in the comments. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, do the same thing. And I hope that you stay tuned for Book 1, Chapter 2.